Welcome to Narrative Responsibility, a podcast about examining the meta-story of your life, how well it is serving you, and how to change it for the better. I'm Elena Wolf, relationship coach and life alignment mentor, and this is this week's New Perspective. Hi there! I'm so glad you're here today. This is episode 29. Type as a lawful neutral narrative. So, hello, we're back. I so appreciate your patience for my unscheduled break. I just kind of had this whole pile-on of events that were bound by actual linear time, and they sort of collided and all came at me at once. So, compounding that was the fact that I had an entire episode that I had scripted and recorded and realized when I went in to edit that the script was bad. And it was a week when I just didn't have time to either try to rewrite it or try to find another topic to script out instead. So we just had a hiatus because I presented at a conference and also moved into a new workspace and also applied to graduate school and also. So here we are. I was really happy to present at the British Association for Psychological Types online conference. This is the second year in a row that I've done that. And it was just a really great couple of days nerding out about MBTI and Jungian type. And the reason I bring this up is because my topic today is going to be an adaptation of what I presented at the conference. Now, in order to make this a little bit different and kind of honor the fact that that was a unique presentation to them, and then maybe also honor the fact that not everyone who listens to this podcast is a deep type nerd, I am actually going to go a little bit heavier on the groundwork kind of meta perspective stuff and a little bit lighter on the type dynamics. So hopefully for my non-type listeners, this will still be pretty approachable and give my type knowledgeable peeps something that they can kind of go away and think about on their own. Right. So my presentation title was Shifting Relationship Narratives with Type. And the main idea of it was using type as a neutral ground or a neutral story in order to enhance understanding within relationships of any stripe, and specifically in the context of a conflict. In other words, using type to enhance empathy. So let's talk about why we might need to enhance empathy in our relationships in the first place, and then secondarily, how type can help us to do it. Okay, so going back to the whole meta concept of this podcast itself, let's talk about the fact that humans understand our experiences by creating stories about them or stories that come out of them. What are stories in this context? Well, at its most basic, a story is a series of linear time events that are linked by cause and effect, or what you might think of as action and consequence. In a more psychological sense, stories are interpretations of events. They are patterns. They are memory aids. You see, stories are really useful ways for us to encode a lot of information without having to remember like a ton of details about it. If you can condense like an entire day's worth of events into one story that you're able to summarize, then you've actually put a whole lot of information condensed down into this symbolic concept. You're using language and you're using ideas and maybe these emotional cues that like, okay, here were the highlights of the day. Here were the emotions that can anchor my memories. So that if I need to go back and access that memory, I have the keywords to do it. And then it's like bringing up a file in a zip drive, right? You have the high level of the file names And you don't necessarily have to go into the whole file in order to remember it. But then if you want to go into the whole file, you have it. So in terms of understanding our world and our life experiences and being able to access those again later to create some kind of coherence to our linear experience through time as we keep living and growing and experiencing things, that's kind of the purpose of creating these stories and curating our memories in this way. Stories are also really helpful for understanding what happened, but sometimes that can get us into trouble because we can misinterpret cause and effect quite easily. Well, why is this? The first reason might be that we are only seeing part of the picture, whether this is deliberate or not. We might not even realize that we're not seeing the whole picture. But when you don't see the whole picture of what's happening, you have incomplete data. And that causes you to miss connections that were relying on data that was outside of the scope of what you were looking at. Or you might see connections that aren't there because it looks like from this scope of view that you have that there's a cause and effect, but maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe it was two effects from a similar cause that was lying outside of your scope of view. The other reason, and this is more of a type-based reason that we might be misinterpreting what's happening, is that we have different cognitive distortions or perceptual filters than the other person in the situation. Some of this is not type-related. For example, subconscious emotional beliefs that are based on our experiences and what we kind of assumed to be true or learned from those experiences that end up shaping how we see the world and how we see ourselves. I've talked about this before, but as an example, if you have someone who did not have a lot of emotional support within their family, they got normalized to a way of relating where they didn't receive emotional support, they didn't offer it, they just kind of handled their own thing. And that can lead them to being suspicious or rejecting when they're offered emotional support, or just not even recognizing that it's being offered to them at all. And that is a perceptual filter that's based on this emotional belief that came out of their experiences that emotional support is not part of relationships. That's just something I give to myself and everyone else gives to themselves, and we go on. And there might also be what we could see as like egoic defenses or egoic desires that will cause us to project a certain story onto a situation. And that's either because we want it to be true or because we fear what might happen if that story were not true, which maybe it's a distinction without a difference, but I feel like they're slightly different there. But usually when this is happening, we actually know on some level that we're lying to ourselves, or that we're kind of grasping at straws or trying to tell ourselves this hopeful story that we do on some level know is not actually true. Whereas when we're talking about really deep emotional beliefs, there is no awareness that it's not true, because that was true. We genuinely believe that to be true about ourselves and about the world. So these egoic stories are ones where part of us is really trying to insist that it's true, and part of us is like, yeah, I don't think so. And then the part of this that does relate to type, I'm calling perceptual filters. And these would be like our cognitive functions that prioritize certain information and either don't recognize or disregard other types of information. So those are some of the various ways that we misunderstand things. And honestly, all of these misunderstandings and misperceivings could actually be fine if we had a culture that normalized comparing our internal narratives to the internal narratives of other people and being willing to have them corrected. We could get it wrong all day long and just laugh every time that we found out. And In relationships of any kind in this hypothetical culture, we would just both set our respective stories out into the space between us. And that process would be part of what helped us decide if we were in conflict in the first place. And then if we were in conflict, we would be starting from a shared understanding toward resolving it. But we don't live in a society like that. We live in a society where at a collective level, we have emotional beliefs about being wrong. In this case, I'm meaning in the sense of simply being incorrect, not necessarily morally wrong, although they're subtly linked. But we have these beliefs about being inaccurate that sound something like this. I'm stupid if I get it wrong. I'm foolish if I get it wrong. I am worthless, or just worth less, if I get it wrong. I'll be mocked if I'm wrong. I will be judged or criticized if I got it wrong. I will be shamed if I got it wrong. I will be rejected if I got it wrong. I will lose respect or social standing if I got it wrong. I am bad if I am wrong. Those are some pretty intense messages, really. You don't want to be wrong if you have any of those running around your subconscious on a belief level, much less all of them, or even just some of them. But a lot of us have all or most of those messages because they're encoded in our culture right now. And so those kind of cultural beliefs that we all absorb and inherit create a lot of internal pressure to either not ever be wrong, which I think we all know on some level is an impossible goal, or to not ever to be seen as wrong, to not ever admit to being wrong, which as a strategy does protect against the consequences for being wrong in the short term, but it comes at the expense of being able to be honest and authentic and have a sense of safety in our relationships. Because if we have to maintain an appearance of not being wrong, then that means that everything we do must be right. And if we stop being right, then suddenly we're going to be unsafe because we're going to be seen as being wrong. We're going to have to admit that we're wrong. And all of those consequences that we're so afraid of are going to come straight at us. And when we apply this belief that we can't be wrong to conflicts, then that means that the other person, not us, not ourselves, has to be the one that's wrong if there's a conflict. We'll fight them over it, even if it's someone that we love, even if they aren't actually wrong. Because if we admit to being wrong, then we're going to be toast anyway. So if the relationship is going to end because they're suddenly perceiving us as a worthless fool who's lost all respectability for being wrong, then we might as well let this relationship end over a conflict and insist that we're right so that we can at least salvage our pride and maybe our social standing. I mean, it makes sense, right? And yes, on a survival level, it does make sense. Based on those deep-seated emotional beliefs that being wrong is very bad, it makes sense to make sure that we're never wrong. But there's more to our reluctance to be wrong in a conflict than just our reluctance to be wrong. Also, many of us, most of us, all of us, find it hard to see beyond our own perspective until we train ourselves to do that. And this is kind of where the type stuff comes in. If someone has a cognitive preference for seeing the emotional needs and currents as the most important factor in making a decision, then they might ignore the data about what it costs or the feasibility of something, whereas somebody who prioritizes getting projects done might be focused on those and totally oblivious to the emotional impact of any course of action. And if neither of those two people stop to articulate how they're seeing the situation, what they're seeing as the relevant factors, and honestly, kind of what they're seeing as the relevant goal, then they might both kind of look at the other person and see someone who is showing up as kind of stupid or willfully blind to what's obvious, or maybe someone who's cruel and just intentionally ignoring these other factors. And if we add in the needs of our egoic defenses to not be wrong, then seeing past our own story can become difficult or even impossible without some kind of cognitive intervention. And yeah, when we can't allow ourselves to be wrong and we can't easily see the other person's perspective, then it's almost inevitable that we entrench into this one person's right, one person's wrong kind of binary way of thinking. And when we have that mode of thinking, every miscommunication tends to escalate into a conflict. And every conflict reinforces our belief that we kind of have to fight for our place in a relationship, in society. But that's not actually an effective way to build relationships. Because relationships are built on collaborations, not conflicts. Collaboration requires a consensus. And a consensus often requires empathy, which is seeing the other person's point of view and integrating that perspective into the common or shared story. Cognitive empathy is not the same as sympathy or even compassion. It is simply understanding the perspective that another person is coming from. What information are they prioritizing? What beliefs do they have, or what values do they have that are causing them to come to the conclusions that they're coming to? But even if there's not a strong emotional response to seeing through someone else's eyes, empathy still undermines our feelings of being right. Because when we can actually see where that other person is coming from, it's hard to maintain that binary belief of I'm right, therefore they're wrong. Which is why most of the time, if we're casting stories, we're resisting empathy. You see, the math of that binary belief goes like this. Only one can be right, therefore the other must be wrong. If I am right, then you are wrong. But if you are right, then I am wrong. So, okay, let's go back to our hypothetical culture where we kind of take away all of the punishments for being wrong. That binary is no longer a big deal in that kind of culture. But since we have a culture that punishes being wrong, or at least that there's a belief that there are consequences, negative consequences to being wrong, then that binary becomes kind of dangerous. It means that we can't be wrong without suffering bad consequences. Therefore, it's unsafe to be wrong. We don't want to be wrong. We can't be wrong. Our survival depends on us not being wrong, which means that they are not allowed to be right. And if empathy makes us see how they might be right, then subconsciously we're going to resist using our empathy, because to have empathy would be to be wrong. And that would mean that we're going to suffer all of those negative consequences of being wrong. So that step from I'm right to I'm wrong, because I saw how the other person was right, that's too far to go. And in a culture like that, in a context like this, our various narratives end up colliding and keeping us stuck in our own perspective, even if that perspective is not accurate, even if it does not truly reflect what is. But what if we had an intermediary step, a neutral ground, such as I might not be right, or they might not be wrong. I might be partly right, and they might be partly right. Or maybe we're both right, or we're both wrong. A neutral ground like that is a space that both people can explore in a non-committal way. It doesn't require you to take a side because you're simply being curious. You're simply asking what if, or saying maybe, or partially. It's not this all or nothing, right, wrong. It's a space in between. So you can ask questions. You can get curious. You can be open-minded about their side and seeing what you might be missing instead of kind of closing off to it in order to protect your own rightness. You can allow empathy in that kind of space, in that kind of neutral space. And psychological type is a great framework, in my opinion, for creating this kind of neutral ground to ask questions. Not only does it create a neutral ground for asking questions, it kind of creates what I would term a lawful neutral ground, because type is a framework that actually has logic and principles behind it. It has external points of reference that you can make. It doesn't vary. Like, it can be applied across many contexts, but the underlying principles remain the same across all those contexts, right? There is a lawfulness to it. There is an order to it. So it's a neutral ground, but also a neutral ground with a framework, with this sense of ordering behind it. So in order to help us get past our own perspective, type can show us our likely perceptual biases, and it can tell us about the other person's likely perceptual biases, at least if we know their type or have a good sense of what their type might be. Type allows us to begin building a shared understanding with another person. It provides us neutral, in the sense of being non-judgmental and non-hierarchical, descriptions for reinterpreting what is happening. It gives us language for dynamics that we might not have been able to put into words on our own. You see, we naturally tend to look at someone else's actions and interpret them through the lens of how we would have arrived at that conclusion. But often this yields an ugly story because, of course, if we arrived in good faith and righteousness at a different conclusion, then what kind of hinky stuff did they have to do to arrive at this other conclusion based on the same set of evidence, right? Or the same set of data? Like, were they deliberately ignoring this moral implication? Were they being selfish and disregarding the impact on the collective, or maybe the environment, or other people in the situation? Are they just really stupid, and that's why they're missing the fact that this idea couldn't possibly work in the actual world for whatever reason? Maybe it's like physics. So that kind of story is really, it's a kind of nasty story, isn't it? To say, the only way I could see myself getting to your conclusion is by doing things that are kind of ugly and maybe against my character, or against my sense of rightness, or against my sense of reality or logic. But when you can look through the lens of type and see how they're actually perceiving the situation, you might be able to recognize that they're not being immoral or selfish or stupid. They literally see different information. Like, they're looking at the same scene you're looking at, but you might as well be looking at different scenes, because what your cognitive filters are telling you is relevant and actionable is so completely different from what theirs are showing them as relevant or actionable. You might have competing goals, or maybe not even competing, but just like different. And it might be that the easiest strategy for them to use to get to their goal interferes with you getting to your goal, but maybe there's a second strategy that they could implement that wouldn't. And so if you can create a shared story about, first of all, what is, and second of all, what all of the goals of the situation are, then you can find strategies that support both goals. So that's where type can come in to help you get past your own distortions, like the distortions of your own cognitive functions and your own type preferences, to understand how someone else might be seeing the situation, to help them understand how you're seeing it, and then work together in this neutral ground between you to come to a shared consensus and create some shared goals and shared strategies. And then suddenly you can go from being in conflict or in gridlock or in this kind of right, wrong, righteous versus immoral kind of binary conflict to collaboration and effective compromise. So real quick, to go over a little bit of the type stuff. In terms of our functions, I found that the judging functions, that is how we make decisions, and our perceiving functions, that is what information we see as most important, create different perceptual filters to look through. So I will talk about broadly our judging functions and broadly our perceiving functions, although flip that order because perceiving functions I'm doing first, and not necessarily go function by function through, but just kind of generally. These are the questions that your perceiving functions are trying to answer. These are the questions that your judging functions are trying to answer. So for our perceiving functions, this is intuiting and sensing, our primary ways of taking in information about the world. We can miss parts of reality or misinterpret parts of what we see. And so there are two questions you can ask yourself or ask this other person to try and create a neutral space outside of your own narrative. First, what do I see that is not there? And second, what am I missing that is there? As an example, in a relationship, maybe the answer to the first question, what do I see that is not there, is that you're seeing a malice or a meanness to their behavior that is not intended. And maybe what you're missing are efforts that they have made to show some support or to show care that simply don't look like what you expected or what you wanted. So if you ask yourself those questions, what am I seeing that is not there? What am I missing that is there? You might be able to realize, oh, I'm ascribing this motive to their behavior that may not actually be their real motive. It may not be anything that they intend. And I might be missing the fact that they have been trying. It just wasn't the way that I expected or what I was looking for. So I didn't see it. Our judging functions in this context of cognitive or perceptual biases relate to what we see as most relevant to take action on. The filter here is basically what is so fundamentally obvious it doesn't even need to be remarked on or articulated. Like, it's just so obvious that's the relevant information to act on. For some people, this might, for example, be the obvious necessity of a low-waste lifestyle. Or for others, it might be the context of other people and the necessity of adjusting your actions accordingly. What is all that banging? Hey man, quit that banging! Jesus Christ. So the questions related to our judging functions that you can ask: what do I find so obvious that it could go without saying? And what does this other person find so obvious that they think it goes without saying? If you both take the time to share, you will likely discover that your, quote, obvious thing was not, in fact, clear to the other person, and that theirs was not, in fact, obvious to you. So if you want to know a little bit more about the specific distortions for each cognitive function, I'm going to put that on my Patreon. And yeah, to wrap up today in this concept, if you take one thing away from this episode, I want it to be this: test your stories. Don't just assume that your interpretation is accurate and proceed as if it is. Challenge it. Make sure that you are acting on good information, not just beliefs that might be insubstantial and, again, inaccurate to reality. Test your stories. All right. That is it for today. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. If you want to know more about my work as a coach, you can check out thepatternbreaker.com or follow me on my lackadaisical Instagram at thepatternbreaker. If you want to join my Patreon and get some of the cool perks like extra information and maybe chances for Zoom events, you can check out patreon.com/narrative responsibility. And until next time, what part of your story are you going to take responsibility for this week?